Okay, so I'm just going to go over the midterm here quickly, just so you guys can start thinking about studying for it. The midterm, as it says in the syllabus, will take place the week of June 29th. So you have just under a month to study it. It is a take-home midterm, right? You do not have to write it in class, obviously, because how would we even do that? And you have basically 5 days to work on it. So the way it's going to work is it's going to be posted Monday morning, June 29th, which is a Monday, and it will be due electronically Friday evening, July 3rd. I'm not sure exactly what time Friday evening on July 3rd, but we'll work that out. The way it will work in terms of how to receive and post it is I will post it as a file on Quarkus. I will also send it in an announcement or as a message to everybody just to make sure everybody got it. On Quarkus. I'll also make it available on Slack as well, just so it's basically everywhere that there is a medium of communication between us and you. And as I said, it's take home. So you have 5 days to work on it. Now there are 2 sections. The first section is short identifications that'll be worth 20%. And the second section is essay questions, which will be worth 80% of your grade. So that tells you something. My advice, always start with the essay questions first. And the reason I tell students to do that is it gets them out of the way. All right. Now, in a take-home exam, maybe it's less important, but I find start with the essay questions first because they're the ones that are going to require the most thought and time, and you'll probably have the most energy and at the beginning. Toward the end of it, you'll be sick of it. Now, you choose 2 questions from each section. So for the short identification section, you have to answer 2 questions. For the essay section, you have to answer 2 questions. Okay? So studying for the midterm. Now, just going to go over some, advice and skills that you can think of on how to study. Obviously, review your notes is obvious, and try to secure notes that you do not have. Catch up on readings that you missed or did hastily. Figure out which readings were the most important. You want to distill your notes. Do not just try to cram facts. Studying for a humanities exam or a social science exam, for those of you that I say come out of management or science or in other disciplines, it's not just about memorizing everything. I mean, if you can remember everything that we've gone over, that's great, but it's not enough. You want to think critically about these concepts, right? You want to try to identify what you regard as the most important, right? So think about it. Things that I've spent the most time on, things that I've emphasized that you really need to know versus things that I've you don't need to know this, right? So really start to think about what was most important. Things that I've talked about each class, right? Key concepts, for example. They're called key concepts for a reason. You have to know them, right? So you want to identify and work to understand those key concepts. And you want to figure out you really want to have a sort of mastery of them, okay? You want to start studying early. I would recommend start studying now. Again, I mean, I know some students are able to cram, but study after study has shown you retain far more information if you study 30 minutes a night for 3 weeks versus 5 hours a night for 2 days, right? You retain it more. You're going back to it. It's repetition. Right? So make sure you start studying for the exam now. Also, make sure that you have watched all the lectures. Because I'm posting it on YouTube, I can see the analytics. So for the first couple lectures, I think pretty much all of you have watched them. But make sure, especially this lecture and the next lecture, you really, really watch. One, because you have less time to really sit with the material, whereas the first, second, and third lecture, you've had a lot more time to actually sit and digest that material and have it reviewed. So make sure you watch all the lectures. Okay. Now we'll look at what some of these questions will look like. So the short answer questions or ID questions will look like this. It'll be things like division of labor, triangle of trade, Hernando Cortez. And it's not just about describing these things. So if you're going to describe the division of labor, the triangle of trade, yes, the description of it is important. You want to put it in its historical context. So if you're talking about the triangle of trade, you want to talk about how it emerged in the Atlantic trading system. If you're talking about Hernando Cortez, you have to know who he is, why he matters, the time period in which he was operating in, what he did. The more detail, obviously, the better. But the most important thing that you have to do with short ID questions is the who cares question, right? Why does the division of labor matter? You want to talk about how do these things matter in the history of capitalism? What is important about the division of labor? Why is it important to the history of capitalism? Why is the triangular of trade important in the history of capitalism? Why is Hernando Cortés important in the history of capitalism? And you also want to look at the context under this. It's not just who Hernando Cortés is, it's what he does and what it leads to. Right? I like to think of ID questions as miniature essays on why they matter. And in this context, why they matter to the history of capitalism. Okay? That's how you want to think of it. Sample essay questions, these will vary. Okay? Some of them will be pretty straightforward. Some of them will be a little bit more abstract and allow you to kind of think more freely. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. Okay? So one question, and it's not just going to be two, you'll have a lot more choice than just two questions, is how far can it be argued that the rise of towns and cities were central to the rise of capitalism? Okay? So you're going to write an essay here, right? Now that's pretty straightforward. Now the next one is a little bit more abstract and is a much more challenging question. So if you want to play it safe, I would recommend answering a question like this. However, if you have a lot to say and are really engaged with this material, provided you do a good job, we do take into account and want to reward students for taking a risk and writing or at least trying to answer a question that is much more challenging, right? So in this case, if money comes into the world with a congenital blood stain on one cheek, capital comes dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. Now that's pretty abstract. So what you want to try to do is it's just discuss that. What does that mean in the history of capitalism? What does that mean about what capitalism is? What is the difference between capital and money, right? And think about the weird metaphor that's being used here, right? If money comes into the world with blood stained on one cheek and capital has blood dripping from everywhere, well, that tells you something about what the difference is between capital and money, okay? I'm not going to give you the answer, but that's sort of what we're looking at. And I'm going to give you some tips to answering the essay questions. Make sure you answer the actual question. It's very easy when you're trying to answer these questions, especially that second one, by losing sight of what the question is. Always remind yourself when you're writing, am I answering the question? Make sure you must refer to the readings and lectures, okay? You really have to. It has to be grounded in the readings. Ideally, and this is a take-home test, right? So you are expected to reference readings and lectures. If you're talking about something that came from the reading on Lynn, Massachusetts, you need to cite that reading. You need to say what it was talking about. Also, if you're talking about the lectures, also cite which lecture it was, right? What was being said. You want to use specific examples, be as specific as possible. So if you're writing an essay, you don't want it to sort of devolve into generalities where you're just making general statements about capitalism. You need specific, concrete examples. Okay, so if you're talking about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, if that's a question, you need to have specific examples. You can't just talk, abstractly and generally. You want to be as nuanced as possible. Consider alternative points of view. Your essay does have to have a thesis. You have to argue a point. It has to be well organized. Obviously, we're not expecting this essay to be as good as something you've spent weeks or months on. You have a week, so we understand that. But it does have to be at a much higher level than, say, if you had 2 hours to write it. So make sure it's edited. Make sure it's nuanced. Consider alternative points of view. Make sure it has a thesis. Make sure it's organized with an introduction, body points, and a conclusion. Okay? And try to write the best prose as possible. Edit and proofread your essays. Don't just finish it and hand it in. Right? I mean, if you have to, you have to. But you really want to make sure it's as polished as it can possibly be in 5 days. Okay, if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll talk a little bit more about this next class.